Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Empowering Plans Podcast, a special edition podcast, the post-game of the State of the Union address, which we do pretty much every year now here at FIA, because as you all know, this is a very important speech in which the president lays out his policy agenda, or in other cases, celebrates his successes. And in this case, we wanted to look and see what was said about healthcare, what wasn't said about healthcare. And joining me to talk about this very important speech is our very own attorney, Nick Bonds. Say hello, Nick.
Hey, Brady. Happy to be here.
I thought you might be, coming from all the way over in Texas, you have a sort of different perch and perspective in hearing the speech from last night. It's kind of a weird one. I think I read somewhere it's the first time that the president or any president has given 3 states of the union in a row with different speakers behind him, because there's quite a lot of turmoil, as we know, in Congress, and not as much I think we can say has gotten done in the area of healthcare policy that we want to see and that our clients want to see. But the president did talk about a few things that were important. We want to get to them. But before we do that, just thought we'd give our overall impressions of how we think the speech went with respect to healthcare and what the president sort of laid out for his vision, and maybe, a tad bit of politics is, I guess, okay. So I'll start off and just say that, this was actually a shorter speech, maybe not like in the context of all the State of the Union addresses that have been given, but I remember President Trump would give much longer ones and, call out the guests in the crowd. This felt like it was more of like a campaign speech. It was kind of like quick and to the point. Broad strokes were kind of painted with respect to the policy agenda the president has. He talked about a lot of his wins, and we'll talk about them in some detail here. But the ones that caught my eye just briefly, he did reference, obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act. He even harkened back to the ACA, right? He talked about the PACT Act, which people don't know enough about, including in our own industry, and we can go into that a little bit later on. He talked about reproductive health care from a broad perspective. He seemed very energetic, kind of shouting at times, prepared for some of the back and forth that I think happened on various other topics that he knew would be fiery. But my overall sense is that I wish there was a bit more, honestly, on healthcare here. I think he missed some opportunities to talk more about what he planned to do in the future. There's a few things he said, but there's a ton of things there, right, on prescription drugs, on PBMs, things that Congress has stalled on doing. And we know that healthcare remains one of the top issues for Americans in terms of what they're spending their money on and what they feel like is broken in society. So I thought there was some more he could have said in some more detail that I was looking for, but I did not see. But what did you think, Nick, overall?
Yeah, I think overall, like you said, I'm here in Texas, so I'm an hour behind you there in Boston, but also everybody in the capital. And man, I'm glad it was as short as it was, because it was about 10:30 when it ended for me here. I could feel my eyes starting to droop a little bit. But I do think that my biggest impression of the speech was probably just that it was a rowdy time in Congress. There were a lot of people vigorously standing up and clapping. I think President Biden had more standing ovations in the first 10 minutes of that speech than we've seen in a long time. And like you said, the Republicans in there, and Mike Johnson specifically, was pretty adamantly staying rooted in their seats, it felt like. But you had a lot of people on the conservative side of the chamber heckling a bit. You had President Biden kind of going off prompter and dishing it out a little bit with some of the heckles. I thought it was interesting that the Supreme Court marched in, and we've seen some of the contentiousness that Biden's administration and the Democrats in general have felt with the Supreme Court here lately. I think notably, I don't think Clarence Thomas was there. He was probably riding around in his motor coach out of protest. But yeah, overall, it was a very political, not even just political, it felt more like a campaign speech than just the standard politics that we're used to out of the State of the Union. And it really felt like President Biden was trying to sort of throw down a marker and sort of draw a number of distinctions between himself and former President Trump. And I think, like you said, he maybe missed an opportunity to do more about that in the healthcare space. But yeah, he did call it specifically trying to enshrine Roe v. Wade into law, trying to resurrect the protections for reproductive freedom. I think I noticed that more in this speech than anything else, that President Biden never refers to abortion. He always refers to reproductive freedoms. But he made a point of trying to enshrine the protections of Roe v. Wade into law. And he mentioned expanding a few of his other healthcare actions. You could probably speak a little more in depth on some of what he was trying to do with the Inflation Reduction Act and expanding some of those protections. But yeah, I think my broad impression, like you, is this was lighter on healthcare than I wanted it to be. But there are a couple things that are probably worth diving into.
Yeah, so let's do that. So, I mean, a couple of things that he talked about. Also, just to note here at the start, you mentioned the Supreme Court, they could be very soon issuing an opinion that would really jeopardize a lot of federal policymaking, including that has been done by the Biden administration and perhaps things he was relying on them doing. So stay tuned for that. You can follow our other media on the Chevron cases that we've been watching for that information. But I want to talk about the things the president mentioned just briefly here that were important for us. He referenced back to the Inflation Reduction Act, again, passed in 2022, a big component of which was the ability for CMS to negotiate 20 drugs. Now, we're talking about the first 10 drugs at this point, and that's starting, I think, over a year from now. So it's really not all that much, to be honest, about the ability CMS will have. It's something, it's a first step. The president called for over the next decade, he'd like to see 500 drugs be added to the mix that CMS can negotiate. He mentioned how the VA does this now. I mean, this is one of those things that everyone agrees this obviously should be done. Both sides of the aisle, there's a tremendous support for this. It's common sense, right? It's just
and that does the prescription drugs price reduction approaches of the Biden administration. That seems to be a pretty consistent theme, trying to have government be a bit more directly involved, trying to limit the impact of middlemen like PBMs on prescription drug prices, and some of those protections under the IRA, the ability of CMS to negotiate more drug prices directly. That all seems kind of part and parcel with some of what we've seen before.
Yeah, he talked about as well capping insulin prices, which was done for Medicare patients, but not for those with private insurance. He wants that to be expanded. A lot of, wish list kind of thing here. We don't expect that to actually happen. There's not enough support in Congress for that, and you need a law because of ERISA, of course, to have an impact in that respect. He did briefly reference the ACA and mention how, it's something that he obviously was in the White House when that was passed, and he's helped to prevent efforts by Republicans to repeal that law. So that's not going anywhere for the time being.
I just want to say, I really liked his joke, actually. If anybody remembers in 2010 when President Obama was signing the ACA into law, Biden shook his hand and was caught on a hot mic saying, "This is a big effing deal." In the speech last night, Biden sort of self-referentially harkened back to that, saying, "That's still a big deal." I was amused. I had to get that reference in.
He had to have a couple jokes for sure. It was a laugh track. I feel like it's a lot of parts, not the speech there, but just finishing up on things I wanted to cover. He did talk about the PACT Act, which again is a bill that not a lot of Americans know a lot about, frankly, but it was very important because it basically expanded access to veterans who were impacted by toxic burn pits from exposure in various foreign wars, and they weren't getting the care that they needed back before this act. And effectively what it really does for our purposes in the industry is it really makes it more easy for the VA to pay for claims related to this exposure, whereas before, exposure to toxic burn pits was not automatically, or it was not presumed that you got, cancer from exposure on a battlefield, and the VA wouldn't pay for a lot of these services, and so private health insurance had to pay for it, or in some cases would deny it. It was a big mess that patients found themselves in. So now it's much easier. The VA is to presume that many of these illnesses were caused by battlefield injuries, and therefore they'll pay. And so there's opportunities there for third-party recovery and overpayments, et cetera. So it's a pretty important bill from a monetary perspective for plans, but also clearly for veterans as well. He mentioned in passing pretty quickly the ARPA-H program, which he launched to battle cancer. Obviously, his son died of brain cancer a number of years ago, so it's important initiative to him. That'll continue on, I'm sure, beyond President Biden's term, that program. And so that was good. Just quickly, what he didn't mention that I wish he did was more on prescription drug. He had a little throwaway line about importing drugs is cheaper from other countries, including Moscow, which he didn't intended to reference Russia there, but he did. He's correct, of course, that drugs are much cheaper there. Not really much detail as much as I would have liked to have seen on that front. he didn't talk about one thing that's controversial was his administration is pushing to tighten staffing in nursing homes, which is an important thing. It's a shortage there in nursing homes for staffing. And I was reading some articles this morning, it was not addressed, and people had hoped that he would talk more about that. But I think really the two things that he led with healthcare on are things I want to turn over to you, Nick, for, which are things mostly related to IVF and reproductive health. So why don't you tell us about what he did say there and perhaps what he didn't say?
Yeah, so President Biden touched on the controversy that we've seen spring up around IVF in the wake of the big decision in Alabama that essentially declared that embryos being used as a part of in vitro fertilization have the same rights as children and are essentially protected. And that sort of led to IVF being halted briefly in the state of Alabama. I think now Alabama has actually passed a law trying to protect IVF treatments, and the big IVF providers in the state have started, proceeding again with some of their IVF treatments. But Biden specifically called out the controversy swirling around IVF in the wake of that, and he urged Congress to guarantee the right to IVF and guarantee it nationwide, which was kind of similar to, kind of goes hand in hand with what he was saying about abortion and protecting reproductive freedom nationwide, and asking Congress to do everything it can to try to guarantee that and protect it. He touched a little bit on his push for a cancer moonshot, trying to, do everything it could to marshal all of the federal government's resources to ending cancer, which will be interesting to see how quickly and effectively that can happen. He touted the ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, which I think it's going to be interesting to see what that organization can do. It looks like that's essentially been organized under the NIH and is going to be doing a lot of work trying to promote cancer research, trying to research more into women's health, and doing a lot of good things basically for healthcare here in the United States. You mentioned a lot of things that would have been nice to hear Biden speak on a little more substantively. Towards the end of his speech, Biden did have I don't want to call it a throwaway line, but he did just very tangentially reference the potential for AI, specifically in the healthcare space, and what AI can do to promote healthcare. And that sort of echoed his executive order on AI and healthcare from last December, where he touted research grants and some pushes for practices to guarantee, privacy, security, safety in implementations of AI, specifically in the healthcare space going forward. So it could lead to some interesting stuff. So we'll have to keep an eye on things as the campaign goes forward.
Yep, absolutely. I think the AI issue is one where he could have gone a bit more in depth. He did talk about how he would like to ban the use of AI for like voice copying, which I think is a very smart thing perhaps to do, but we'll see where that leads off. I think ultimately, like we said at the start, this is a campaign speech effectively. This obviously is an election year. Before you know it, it'll be time to go to the polls and vote. And so it's not surprising that he led with other priorities, really foreign priorities was the first part of his speech. And where he did talk about healthcare, it was on issues that his political team, I'm sure, correctly told him are important for voters, things like reproductive health and the IVF issue in particular. That one is one in which most Republicans actually, disagreed with what happened there in Alabama. So I wasn't surprised, but I did wish for a bit more in depth. And nonetheless, we got what we got. So we're happy to break it down as we always do after the State of the Union. So we want to make sure that if you listeners have questions about any of these topics, reach out to us. We can expand on either more on the laws that were passed in this administration in the past and talk about the details there and the impact, or more of our predictions for what we think could happen throughout the rest of this year as we somehow fly through March at a record-breaking pace. So with that said, thank you all for your attention, for listening. Thanks to Pat, the producer, for recording for us on behalf of Nick Bonds and myself here at the FIA Group. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.